When we first meet Jacob, he is in his mother's womb, and he's already causing problems.
Yeah.
Now, the statement in Genesis 25 is that 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. And they will come out as Esau and Jacob, but then the elder will serve the younger, which is a favorite biblical theme of the reversal of order like this. But it might be an opportunity for us to reflect a little bit on the origin of these patriarchal stories anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, is Jacob a person or is he a nation?
Is Esau a person or a nation? What about Ishmael? You know, one of the things that you see over and over again in these stories is virtually every character stands in for a people. This is true going back to, you know, certainly back into the primeval history, where Noah's 3 sons divide into all the peoples of the world, but also, of course, Abraham's nephew Lot, who, through his own daughters, creates the people of Ammon and Moab. And then comes Ishmael, who stands in for the Ishmaelite tribes, and now Esau, who is associated with the nation of Edom. And of course, Jacob's children will become the tribes of Israel.
Tribes, yeah. So that all of these individuals are more than just individuals.
Yeah.
And
the relationships between them are more than just personal stories, right? They stand in large part for interethnic and international relations. Right?
So this is great stuff for an anthropologist.
I don't think there's any question.
How people construct their relationships by genealogies, and it is very much an exercise in constructing it.
That's right. I mean, I think we have to remember that one of the things that happened regularly in the ancient world was because there was such an emphasis on marriage within the clan, within the family, and you see that in the story of Isaac, where Abraham sends his servant to get a wife for Isaac from the right family. Yeah. And again in the story of Jacob, where Isaac and Rebekah send Jacob to get a wife from the right family. That concern with we have to be married within the people, right, within our people.
And this is an old tribal concern.
Absolutely.
This isn't just something that arose in the post-exilic period.
No.
Although when it will be a big issue again.
Right, but its origin comes from a period when the clan had specific land holdings that had to be kept within the family, had been in the family for sort of generations and time immemorial, and you had to keep marrying within the family. The problem is, you can't really keep marrying within the family. Right? You run out eventually of options. So what happens when you marry someone from a different tribe? What happens is this process called fictive kinship, where you and those people suddenly realize, oh, we have an ancestor in common.
Yes.
Right? And now there's a narrative of how this came to be.
And of course, the important thing is that you not marry a Canaanite.
Right.
Because if you have to go outside the family, go a ways outside. The last person you want is that pesky neighbor.
Right. It's interesting how Israel is, over the course of Genesis, genetically related to Ammonites, Moabites, Arameans, Mesopotamians, Ishmaelites, and Edomites, but never Canaanites, and never Egyptians.
And this, of course, is all the more interesting because the current consensus of scholarship is that the Israelites actually were Canaanites.
Yeah.
That they were just a group of Canaanites who packed up and went up to the highlands at some point.
That's right. So, I mean, I think you can actually see right there what's happening, right? This is classic self-definition, right? We're going to define ourselves against our context, against the people that we most want to be separated from. And the people you most need to be separated from are always the people you are closest to.
Now, having said all that, Jacob is still an interesting character.
Jacob is Jacob is the first great character in the Bible.
Because, Isaac, as you said, is bland. Abraham is actually a bit dull.
I certainly agree.
Ways, but you couldn't say that about Jacob.
No, from start to finish.
Now, one of the things that he does is steal his brother's birthright.
Yep.
You have one story that says that Esau sold it himself for a mess of pottage. But then the more longer one is how Jacob fools his poor blind father in order to get the blessing that should have gone to the elder son.
Yeah. All the way through, Jacob is taking advantage of other people's weaknesses. All the way through.
Yeah.
So he takes advantage of Esau's hunger by getting Esau to trade the birthright for a bowl of stew. And then he takes advantage of Isaac's blindness by pretending to be Esau, right, dressing up in Esau's clothes and putting fur on his exposed skin to make him look like Esau, the hairy man, and taking advantage of his father's inability to tell by sight and by smell and by touch who he's blessing. And when Jacob goes off to Aram to find a wife, and he comes across Leah and Rachel and starts his family there, he takes advantage there of his uncle Laban's greediness and sort of makes deals with him with, you give me certain sheep and I'll tend them for you, and you want me to work for you, and there ends up stealing essentially most of Laban's flock to sustain himself.
This reminds me, quite some years ago, I was doing a seminar for the Biblical Archaeology Society, and I was doing these stories in Genesis, and essentially regaling people with the details of the biblical stories. And a woman came up to me afterwards very upset and said, "Are you saying that we were all cheats and liars?" My reaction was, I didn't realize you were one of them in the story. But now, some people at least have a moral problem with this.
Yeah.
From the authorial perspective, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have, and this has been studied in some very nice detail by scholars, what you have here is Jacob playing the classic role of the trickster, a stock character from folklore from around the world, and one that is not condemned for being a trickster, usually celebrated. Right? People like to hear stories of how their ancestor really stuck it to
That's right,
whomever.
yes. Now, you could say he doesn't kill anybody, but I suppose, he does cheat people. And he does things you wouldn't like it if he did them to us.
Yeah.
But the whole point is that these stories are told for people who identify with Jacob, and so he's doing them to the other guy, and it's okay.
And you have to remember that the story begins, as you said, with God saying to Rebekah, the younger one will supplant the older one. In other words, from the very beginning, we know that this is how it's supposed to go. We know it's divinely ordained, and we're watching Jacob entertainingly play out the divine plan.
And what does God see in Jacob anyway? Why is he still so well disposed to him?
I mean, Jacob is introspective. He's the quiet one. He's the clever one. I think that I'm willing to say that I think that from the perspective of the Israelite authors, the contrast between the younger, more physically vulnerable Jacob and the brawny, physically strong Esau probably reminded them of the difference between them as a country, the vulnerable, small, and the nations around them that were all much more powerful.
But I think it's also true, of course, in folklore with tricksters, that these tend to be likable characters in spite of it all. And there is an element of that in it too.
What's interesting, though, is that this is not a story, and I think this is true of many trickster stories. The trickster gets a comeuppance, right? Eventually.
Eventually.
Right?
Yeah.
It might not be such a terrible one, but the trickster always gets tricked back.
Yeah.
And with Jacob, this happens most prominently when he goes to his cousin Laban to marry, or Laban, right? To find someone to marry, and thinks he's going to marry Rachel, and is tricked into marrying, right, in the cover of night when he can't see, right? He's tricked into marrying the other daughter, right, Leah.
Yeah, although you could say he comes out of it ahead.
Eventually.
He gets two for the price of one, you might say. Well, not quite. He still has to pay for the second one. And he will get tricked again more poignantly in the Joseph story, which we'll get to later on. Now, there's another kind of story that we deal with here in the Jacob stories. And the dream at Bethel would be a good example of it. And this is what we might call a cultic etiology or a cult legend.
That's right.
The story, is where he's going and he lies down and takes a stone as a pillow, at Bethel, and he has this vision of the angels coming up and down, and he says, surely God is in this place. This is the house of God.
And then he takes the pillow, sets it up as a stone for worship.
Yes.
Later on, he'll come back to the place and build an official altar there at God's command. So what the story exists for is clear enough, right? That there was the place called Bethel where they had a sanctuary, which we know is the case.
Yeah.
And they had a story to say, how did this sanctuary start?
And what makes it really interesting is that this is a sanctuary that is widely condemned later in the Hebrew Bible. In the historical books written from the perspective of Deuteronomy, having a sanctuary there was the sin of Jeroboam, or at least half of it. And but here you obviously have people who have no problem with that.
Right. Not only is there a wonderful story here about Jacob having the dream there, but later on, which is a story that comes out of the Elohist source, but later on in chapter 35, there will be a priestly version of the story, where God appears to Jacob there, and it's God's appearance at that moment that is the etiology for the temple there. And what's more, way back in Genesis 13, or 12 or 13, I'm going to say 12 for now, way back in Genesis 12, Abraham is said to have built an altar at Bethel. So there are multiple stories of patriarchs inaugurating a cult site at Bethel, just as there are multiple stories of patriarchs settling and building altars at Beersheba. Right? In other words, the patriarchal stories where they move from place to place and they build altars regularly, right? These all fall under the category of cult etiology, right? The legends that explain why these sanctuaries exist.
Yeah, one of the most puzzling stories in Genesis, I think, has to be in chapter 32, where Jacob is at the Jabbok, where he's crossing a ford, and he encounters some kind of a divine being, and call him an angel or a god or whatever, and wrestles with him and holds on to him till he gives him a blessing.
Yep.
And now, what are we to make of a story like that? You know, some people have done headstands trying to find some spiritual value in it. I would figure this too is basically a cult legend. Why this is a holy place. It always reminds me of the troll under the bridge. But, you know, crossing a ford is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
You may meet strange powers there. And then it gets dressed up a little bit here in Genesis. So this is when Jacob gets to be called Israel.
Yeah, I think that you're right, that the originally sort of localized legend aspect of it, which I think is clear on the face of it, the story doesn't end with it being called Israel. It ends with the place being called Penuel, right? The face of God. Right?
Yeah.
It's always a good indication, right? When you read the stories and they end with, and that's why the place was called, the story was written to explain why the place was called.
The place was called that.
But yes, but there is this aspect in there where this is how Jacob comes to be called Israel. Right, the struggle with God. Now,
you know, I don't think you get much character development overall in the book of Genesis. You could make a case for it with Jacob, that there are a couple of stories where he seems to have mellowed.
Yeah.
And one of these is the story of the rape of Dinah, where the brothers go on a tear, so to speak, and their big concern is their honor that has been violated, and they want revenge. And Jacob says, cool it, boys.
Yeah.
We got to live with these people.
Yeah, Jacob is clearly concerned for the physical well-being. Simeon and Levi are clearly concerned for honor. And the story ends absolutely ambiguously. Jacob says, don't do it. They say, you want our sister treated like this. And then the narrator says, you know, so that's it.
And you just end exactly on the open question.
Right. So, you know, Jacob, I agree. He mellows. He goes from a very active trickster to actually being very passive. Right here, when he hears that Dinah has been raped, he's said to be silent. Right. He keeps quiet about it. Later on in the Joseph story, he's quite passive. Right. He sort of doesn't want to send Benjamin, and so yes, I mean he ages, right? He ages as few characters do, right? Abraham is the same at Genesis 12 as he is in Genesis 25 when he dies, as far as you can tell. Jacob has a real character arc, which I think is what makes him and his stories such a compelling part.